There's a town council meeting somewhere in Kansas. The year is 1871. Men in dusty coats sit around a table and argue about who should wear the badge. The last marshal quit. The one before him got shot. The one before that simply rode off in the night and never came back. So they make a decision that sounds like madness. They hire a man who has already killed other men. Not in war, not by accident, deliberately. They pin a star on his chest and hand him the problem. And somehow, it works better than anything else they tried. That is not a story someone made up. That is documented history, and it happened more than once. If you've never heard the real version of how frontier law worked, not the myth, not the dime novel, stay with me. Because what actually happened is stranger, darker, and more honest than the legend. If you want more history like this, the documented kind, the kind they don't teach, subscribe before we go any further. There's more where this came from. The American frontier in the second half of the 19th century had a problem that nobody in Washington fully understood. Towns were growing fast. Cattle drives were pushing thousands of longhorns through small settlements. The railroad brought money, and money brought men who would do anything to get it. Violence was not an occasional event. It was a condition. The federal government had limited reach. Territorial governments were underfunded and understaffed. A town marshal in Abilene, Kansas in 1871 had no radio, no backup, no forensic evidence, and no pension. He had a gun, a badge, and whatever reputation he could build with those two things. Towns needed men who could survive, not men who had passed a test, not men who had read a book about law, men who had already demonstrated, in the most direct way possible, that they could handle a violent confrontation and come out the other side breathing. The men who fit that description were not always men who had spent their lives on the right side of the law. Sometimes they were, often they were not. And the town councils, practical men who needed a solution before the next cattle drive arrived, made a practical calculation. A man's past crimes were one thing. His usefulness right now was another. James Butler Hickok rode into Abilene as the city marshal in 1871. His reputation was already established and documented in multiple newspaper accounts before he ever took the job. He had killed men. The number is disputed, but the fact is not. He had worked as a scout and a spy during the Civil War. He had been a gambler and a gunfighter. Abilene was the end of the Chisholm Trail. Every season, Texas cattlemen drove their herds north, sold them, and then their cowboys descended on the town with months of wages and no patience for rules. The town needed someone the cowboys would actually be afraid of. They found him. Hickok's documented approach to law enforcement was not subtle. He made it known, publicly, repeatedly, that he would use lethal force if necessary. He was not bluffing. Everyone in that part of the country knew he was not bluffing. That knowledge changed behavior. The documented crime statistics from Abilene during Hickok's tenure show a reduction in the kind of mass violence the town had suffered in previous seasons. Not because Hickok arrested everyone, because the men who might have caused trouble had done the math and decided Abilene wasn't worth dying in. That is deterrence. That is what a town council buys when they hire a man with a proven willingness to kill. Hickok's tenure ended in October 1871. He accidentally shot and killed his own deputy, Mike Williams, during a gunfight with a drover named Phil Coe. It was a documented tragedy. The town council did not renew his contract, but they had gotten what they needed. Abilene survived the cattle trade years. It grew. It became something. Hickok had done the job. Wyatt Earp's history before Tombstone is documented and considerably more complicated than the legend suggests. He was arrested in Indian Territory in 1871 for stealing horses. That charge is in the historical record. He had worked as a gambler and a saloon keeper before he started carrying a badge. His brother Virgil, who served as Tombstone's town marshal, had a similarly complicated background. The Earp brothers were not innocent men wearing badges. They were men who understood violence from experience. They knew how outlaw networks communicated. They knew the hierarchy of criminal organizations because they had been adjacent to those organizations. When they went up against the Clanton and McClory factions in Tombstone, they were not outsiders trying to learn the terrain. They already knew it. The gunfight at the OK Corral, documented in court records, newspaper accounts, and eyewitness testimony, was 30 seconds of violence that ended with 3 men dead. It was also not the clean victory of legend. The subsequent legal battles dragged on for months. Wyatt Earp was accused of murder. He was not convicted, but the accusations were serious and grounded in real questions about whether the lawmen had acted within their authority or simply executed men they had a personal conflict with. That question, whether the lawman's violence and the outlaw's violence were meaningfully different, was asked openly in frontier newspapers. The Tombstone Epitaph and the Tombstone Nugget took opposing sides. The question was not settled then. It is still not settled now. Pat Garrett is the most paradoxical figure in this category. He killed Billy the Kid on the night of July 14, 1881, in Pete Maxwell's bedroom in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The documented record on that killing is clear. Garrett was the Lincoln County Sheriff. He had a warrant. What is also documented is Garrett's own history. He had ridden with the same rough crowd that produced Billy the Kid. He had been a buffalo hunter, a cowboy, a man who spent years in the company of people who lived outside the law's reach. He and Billy the Kid knew each other personally. They had ridden together. Some accounts describe them as friends. When Lincoln County needed someone to stop Billy the Kid's gang, they turned to a man who knew that gang from the inside. Not because they ran out of options, because that kind of knowledge was irreplaceable. You cannot learn the frontier outlaw world from a textbook. Garrett had learned it the hard way, in the field, over years. That made him the right man for the job. Garrett was killed in 1908. The circumstances of his death are disputed and still debated by historians. He was shot in the back of the head near Las Cruces, New Mexico. No one was ever convicted. His life ended the way many frontier lives ended, in violence that the law couldn't quite account for. There is a logic to hiring killers as lawmen that sounds brutal but is actually simple. The frontier did not have the infrastructure that makes modern law enforcement possible. There was no communications network, no coordinated regional response, no forensic evidence gathering, no jail system robust enough to hold serious criminals for long. What a town marshal had was himself, his reputation, his experience, and whatever firepower he could bring. A man who had never killed anyone, never run with outlaws, never spent a night in the kind of places where the worst people gathered. That man was starting from zero. He didn't know the signals. He didn't know which saloon was the meeting point, which trail the rustlers used, which face you needed to recognize before it was too late. He was blind. A man with a violent history knew. He had been in those rooms. He had sat at those tables. He could walk into a situation and read it in a way that a respectable man simply could not. That knowledge kept him alive, and keeping himself alive kept the town safer. The economics were also real and documented. Frontier towns were not wealthy. They were scratching out an existence in difficult terrain with unreliable supply chains and unpredictable revenue. The cattle trade was seasonal. The railroad towns boomed and busted. A municipal government in that environment did not have the budget to hire a professional police force with multiple officers and a support structure. They had budget for one man, maybe two, and those men had to handle everything, not just the dramatic gunfights, but the daily drudgery of keeping order in a town full of armed, exhausted, alcohol-soaked men who had just finished months of brutal work. Men with violent reputations often commanded a premium salary, but they also commanded something more valuable. An immediate effect on behavior that a lesser-known man would have taken months to establish, if he lived long enough. The return on investment was front-loaded. Put a known killer behind the badge and the calculation changes for everyone in the territory overnight. The frontier outlaw networks were not chaotic mobs. They were organized, hierarchical, and communicative. Rustlers coordinated across territories. Stage robbers had lookouts and timing. The men who ran outlaw operations were strategic. They knew which towns had strong law enforcement and which didn't. They knew which marshals were real threats and which could be bribed or intimidated. A marshal who came from that world understood the organizational logic. He knew how the decision-making worked. When he negotiated, and negotiation was a large part of frontier law enforcement, he did it from a position of genuine mutual understanding. He wasn't trying to apply a theory. He was speaking a language he already knew. This is documented in the memoirs and newspaper accounts of the period. Bat Masterson, who served as sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, and later as a deputy U.S. Marshal, wrote extensively about the reality of frontier law. He was explicit. The key to keeping order was making the cost of violence higher than the benefit. A man who could credibly threaten lethal consequences, and had the history to back it up, made that calculation easier. The violence committed by these men while wearing badges was real and documented. Wild Bill Hickok's total number of confirmed kills is estimated by historians at somewhere between 6 and 100, with most serious scholarship settling on a figure in the low dozens. The wide range tells you something about how carefully records were kept. What is clear is that frontier newspapers tracked gunfighter violence with genuine interest and some degree of accuracy. The Las Vegas Gazette, the Tombstone Epitaph, the Dodge City Times. These papers reported shootings, counted bodies, and named names. The men who served as lawmen appeared in those columns regularly, sometimes as heroes, sometimes as the subject of serious accusations. The accusations were not always wrong. There is documented evidence that some frontier lawmen killed men who did not need to be killed. The legal standards of the time were vague on the question of when a marshal's violence became excessive. He was reaching for his gun was a justification that was almost impossible to disprove. It was used, and sometimes it was not true. This is the part of the history that the dime novels left out. The men hired to bring order to the frontier were not clean. They were effective, within limits, in specific situations, under particular conditions. But effectiveness and virtue are not the same thing. The frontier towns that hired known killers were not making a moral statement. They were solving a logistics problem with the tools available to them. That distinction matters because the mythology that grew up around these men, the noble lawman, the righteous gunfighter, obscures what was actually happening. The law on the frontier was made by whoever held power. It was enforced by whoever could survive enforcing it. The badge was a symbol, but the reality behind it was purely pragmatic. Dodge City, Kansas is one of the best documented cases of this pattern. Between 1876 and 1885, the city cycled through a series of lawmen whose personal histories would have disqualified them from policing in any major eastern city. Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, Bill Tillman. These men overlapped and succeeded each other in various roles in Dodge City's law enforcement structure. What they had in common was not virtue. It was competence in a specific and brutal environment. They had all survived things that killed lesser men. They had all made decisions under pressure that left bodies behind. That experience, that particular kind of seasoning, was what Dodge City needed, and Dodge City paid for it and accepted what came with it. The results are documented in Dodge City's own records. The city survived its boom years. It grew into a permanent settlement. The violence that characterized the cattle trade seasons was managed, not eliminated, managed, well enough that commerce continued, that businesses grew, that families eventually moved in alongside the gamblers and the cowboys and the criminals. You could argue about whether those results justified the methods. Men who were appointed to enforce the law were also men who bent it, broke it, and sometimes shattered it entirely when their personal interests were at stake. That tension was visible to people at the time. It was written about. It was debated. The debate never resolved. There are stories that did not make it into the legend. A town marshal in one Texas county in the 1870s, the name is in local records, the incident documented in a county commissioner's report, was discovered to have been taking a cut from the rustling operation he was supposedly suppressing. He knew the operation because he had built part of it. When the arrangement fell apart, the town was left with a bigger problem than the one it started with. That story is not unique. It is a predictable outcome of the system. When you hire a man from the criminal world to police the criminal world, you are making a bet that his loyalty to his badge will outweigh his loyalty to his former associates. Sometimes the bet pays off, sometimes it does not. The frontier did not have a reliable way to tell in advance which kind of man you were getting. This is what the documented record shows, stripped of the mythology. The frontier was not won by noble lawmen riding righteously into the sunset. It was managed. Imperfectly, violently, with enormous moral cost, by men who were products of the same brutal environment they were being asked to control. The law was not brought to the frontier by better men. It was built, piece by documented piece, by men who were willing to do what it took and live with the consequences. If you found this history worth your time, the real version, the documented version, subscribe. Every week there is more. The frontier had more stories than the legend ever told. And most of them are stranger and harder and more honest than what made it into the films. Stay with me. We are not done. The frontier eventually closed, as Frederick Jackson Turner documented in 1893, the famous thesis presented to the American Historical Association. The Census Bureau had officially declared the frontier no longer existed. The open range was fenced. The cattle drives ended. The railroad towns became real towns with real governance structures. And when that happened, the men who had held the line, the killers turned lawmen, the outlaws turned marshals, became a problem for the new order. Their methods did not translate. Their reputations, which had been assets in the violent years, became liabilities in the more settled territory. Some of them adapted. Most did not. Wyatt Earp spent the rest of his long life. He died in 1929, at age 80. Trying to shape his own legend. He talked to writers. He collaborated on accounts of his life. He was keenly aware that his story was becoming mythology, and he had opinions about which version people remembered. He died without being fully honest about all of it. The documented record is still more complicated than what he wanted told. Pat Garrett never found his footing after Billy the Kid. He ranched, he speculated, he worked various law enforcement jobs with diminishing returns. He was broke when he died. The man who ended one of the frontier's most famous careers could not build a stable life from that reputation once the frontier itself was gone. His usefulness had an expiration date. The territory moved on and left him behind. Wild Bill Hickok was already dead, shot in Deadwood in 1876, a card game, the back of his head, 2 queens, 2 aces, the dead man's hand. He did not live to see the frontier close. He did not have to figure out what came next. In that sense, his story is the cleanest, if clean is the right word for a death like that. The towns they policed did not build monuments to the complicated truth of how they were kept safe. They built monuments to the legend. They put up statues of clean-jawed men in perfect hats, and left out the horse theft and the gambling debts and the bodies that didn't entirely need to be there. Because the legend is easier to live with. The legend makes sense of a time that was, in the documented reality, very hard to make sense of. But the documented reality is more useful. It tells you something true about how order actually gets built. Not through virtue descending from above, but through power deployed by imperfect people in impossible situations. The frontier towns hired killers because killers were what worked. That is an uncomfortable sentence, and it is true. The historical record does not allow us to clean it up. The men who wore those badges knew it better than anyone. They did not romanticize what they did. The ones who left written records, Masterson's columns, Earp's accounts, Garrett's letters, described the work in terms of necessity, not glory. They knew what they were. They knew what the towns needed them to be. They showed up and did it. That is the story the legend replaced with something simpler and worse. The real story is harder to carry, but it is the one that actually happened. I've seen enough graves dug for reasons that didn't have to be. The frontier was full of them. Most of the men who dug those graves, or caused them to be dug, were not monsters. They were men making decisions in conditions that don't exist anymore. The decisions they made built something, however imperfectly, however at whatever cost. The documentation is there. The records exist. The newspapers, the court filings, the county commission reports, the letters. It is all there for whoever wants to read it instead of the legend. Subscribe if you want to keep reading it with me. The documented frontier has more to say. We'll be here for it.